In 480 BCE, a tiny force of Greek warriors, led by 300 Spartans, made a legendary last stand. It's a story of impossible odds and ultimate sacrifice that has inspired people for thousands of years. But what's the real story behind the legend? While the movie 300 gave us iconic lines and stunning visuals, the truth of the Battle of Thermopylae is even more heroic. This is the story of how a small, determined band of Greeks used their wits and geography to hold the line and write a story of freedom that would echo through Western history. In the early 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire was the world's only superpower. It stretched from India to Libya, a massive empire ruled by one man who called himself the King of Kings. And in 480 BCE, that king, Xerxes I, set his sights on the scattered city-states of Greece. This wasn't just a war of conquest. For Xerxes, it was personal. A decade earlier, his father, Darius, had tried to invade Greece and was handed a shocking defeat at the Battle of Marathon. Now, Xerxes had raised an army unlike any the world had ever seen to finish the job. The ancient historian Herodotus wrote that Xerxes' army was so huge it drank entire rivers dry as it marched, claiming it had over 2 million fighting men. Modern historians think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but they still put the Persian force somewhere between 70,000 and 300,000 soldiers, an absolutely overwhelming number for the time. As this tidal wave of an army rolled south, many Greek states surrendered. But a few, led by the bitter rivals Athens and Sparta, chose to fight. They formed an alliance, a desperate coalition standing against an empire. They knew they couldn't win in a straight-up fight. They needed a plan, a choke point where geography itself could be their best weapon. They found it in a narrow pass on the eastern coast of Greece. It was a thin strip of land with impassable mountains on one side and the sea on the other. The locals called it Thermopylae, which means the hot gates, named for the hot sulfur springs nearby. It was here that the fate of Greece would be decided. The plan to defend Thermopylae was born from pure necessity. The Greek alliance knew they had to fight a war on two fronts. While their army held the pass, their navy, led by the Athenian politician Themistocles, had to block the massive Persian fleet at the nearby Straits of Artemisium. The two battles were completely linked. If the army fell, the navy would be outflanked. If the navy fell, the Persians could just sail around the pass and land troops behind the army. Everything depended on holding the line at the hot gates. But sending an army wasn't so simple. It was late summer, a time of sacred festivals. For the Spartans, this meant the festival of Carneia, a religious event where warfare was strictly forbidden. But facing an existential threat, the Spartans found a loophole. They couldn't send their whole army, but they could send a small advance force led by one of their kings. That king was Leonidas. He handpicked 300 of his best soldiers. In a grim sign of what was to come, he chose only men who already had sons to carry on their family names. These 300 were the heart of the force, but the idea that they fought alone is one of history's biggest misunderstandings. As Leonidas marched north, other Greeks joined the cause. By the time they reached Thermopylae, the force had grown to around 7,000 men. This included 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, 1,000 Phocians, and soldiers from a dozen other city-states. Still, 7,000 men against an army that could have been over 150,000 was terrifying. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Thermopylae fell, the road to Athens was wide open. The birthplace of democracy would be burned. This wasn't just a battle for land, it was a battle for an idea. The Greeks were experimenting with concepts like democracy, citizenship, and individual liberty, ideas that were the complete opposite of Persia's absolute monarchy. As Herodotus tells it, a Spartan once explained to a Persian that while Persians knew how to be slaves, they'd never tasted true freedom, something a Greek would fight for with his last breath. A loss at Thermopylae would mean the end of that idea, crushed before it could even get started. The Battle of Thermopylae was a collision of two worlds, perfectly embodied by the two men in charge, Leonidas of Sparta and Xerxes of Persia. Xerxes was the king of kings, ruler of a vast multi-ethnic empire. His army was a spectacle of imperial power, with soldiers from every corner of his domain. The infantry was mostly made up of archers and lightly armed spearmen, built for speed and overwhelming numbers. Their main strategy was to rain down arrows on an enemy before the infantry moved in for the kill. At the core of his army was a legendary unit, the 10,000 Immortals. They were Xerxes' personal bodyguard and the empire's elite shock troops. They were called Immortals because if one was killed or fell ill, he was immediately replaced, creating an illusion of invincibility. Xerxes himself commanded not from the front lines, but from a golden throne set up on a nearby hill, watching the battle like a spectator. He had even ordered a canal dug across a peninsula and a bridge of boats built across the Hellespont Strait. To Xerxes, this war was an expression of his power, showing that even nature bent to his will. Facing him was Leonidas, a man forged in the brutal Spartan agoge, a state-sponsored training program every boy endured from age 7. He was raised in a barracks, taught to endure pain and hunger, and trained to be a lethal soldier. He was a soldier first and a king second, a leader who fought alongside his men. His army, the Greek hoplites, couldn't be more different from the Persians. They were citizen soldiers fighting to defend their homes. Their strength wasn't in numbers, but in their gear and their formation. The hoplite was a walking tank covered in bronze armor and carrying a long, heavy spear and a large round shield called an aspis. These soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder in a formation called the phalanx, locking their shields to create a solid wall of bronze and wood with a forest of spears pointing out. In a narrow pass like Thermopylae, the phalanx was a human meat grinder. It completely negated the Persian advantage in numbers, since Xerxes could only attack the front of the shield wall. The Greeks were heavily armored, disciplined, and fighting on terrain that was perfect for their tactics. The brilliance of the Greek plan came down to one thing: their choice of battlefield. Thermopylae in 480 BCE was a defensive dream. It was a narrow path, maybe only 50 yards wide in some spots, squeezed between the steep Kalidromos Mountains and the sea. This natural bottleneck meant Xerxes' massive army had to squeeze through a tiny opening to get to central Greece. This geography made the Persians' numbers almost useless. They couldn't swarm the Greeks or use their cavalry to ride around them. They were forced into a head-on collision with the phalanx. To make the spot even stronger, the Greeks rebuilt a low stone wall at the narrowest point of the pass, giving them a clear defensive line. Leonidas' strategy was simple, but deadly. He would use the phalanx as a human dam to stop the Persian flood. The Greeks fought in rotations, sending fresh troops to the front while others rested. They also reportedly used a clever tactic of feigned retreat. They would pretend to break and run, tricking the Persians into a chaotic charge. Then, just as the enemy thought they'd won, the Greeks would turn, reform the phalanx, and smash into the disorganized mob, causing terrible casualties. Xerxes arrived and saw the tiny Greek force waiting for him. Confident they would lose their nerve and run, he waited for 4 days. The Greeks didn't budge. On the 5th day, his patience gone, Xerxes ordered the attack. The Battle of Thermopylae began. If you're finding this story of strategy and sacrifice fascinating, make sure to subscribe to Ancient Vault and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss our future videos where we explore the greatest battles and legends that shaped our world. On the first day, Xerxes sent in his Medes and Scythians, ordering them to capture the Greeks and bring them to him. The Persian infantry charged into the pass and slammed into a wall of shields and spears. The hoplites' long spears and heavy bronze armor gave them a huge advantage over the lightly armored Persians. In the tight space, the battle became a gruesome, close-quarters slugfest. The Greeks held their ground and inflicted horrific casualties. Frustrated, Xerxes decided to send in his best, the Immortals. Surely his 10,000 elite soldiers could break this stubborn line. But at the hot gates, their reputation meant nothing. They too were funneled into the Greek killing zone. The Spartans and their allies mauled them, reportedly using their feigned retreat tactic to lure them in and cut them down. Herodotus says Xerxes leaped from his throne 3 times in terror and frustration as he watched his best troops get slaughtered. The day ended in a humiliating failure for the Persians. The second day was more of the same. Xerxes, furious, threw wave after wave of soldiers at the Greek line, hoping to wear them down through sheer attrition. But the Greeks just kept fighting, rotating their troops to stay fresh. The pass became choked with the dead, creating a gruesome obstacle for new attackers. Persian archers were useless, their arrows clattering harmlessly off the hoplites' bronze shields. By the end of day 2, the Persian army was demoralized, having suffered thousands of casualties without gaining an inch. It was starting to look like the Greeks might just hold the pass. But as night fell, a local man named Ephialtes came to the Persian king with a secret to sell, a secret that would seal the fate of the heroes at the hot gates. Ephialtes told Xerxes about a hidden mountain trail called the Thermopylae path, which went up and around the pass, coming down behind the Greek position. Leonidas knew about this path and had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers to guard it. Under the cover of darkness, Xerxes sent his immortals to follow Ephialtes. At dawn, they surprised the Phocian guards, who were caught completely off guard. The Phocians retreated to higher ground to make a defensive stand, but the immortals just ignored them and continued down the mountain. Soon, scouts brought the terrible news to Leonidas. They were about to be surrounded. The position was lost. After a quick war council, Leonidas ordered the bulk of the Greek army to retreat. Their stand had already succeeded. They had held the Persians for days, inflicted heavy casualties, and bought precious time for the rest of Greece to prepare. But Leonidas and his 300 Spartans weren't going anywhere. For a Spartan, retreat was the ultimate dishonor. But they wouldn't die alone. In an incredible act of courage, the 700 soldiers from Thespiae chose to stay and share their fate. These weren't lifelong warriors like the Spartans. They were citizens who voluntarily chose to die for the idea of a free Greece. The 400 Thebans also remained, though Herodotus suggests they were kept there against their will because their city's loyalty was in doubt. Knowing the end was near, Leonidas reportedly told his men to eat a good breakfast, because that night they would dine in the underworld. The final battle was ferocious. The remaining Greeks advanced out from the wall to meet the enemy, determined to take as many down as they could. They fought with their spears until they broke, then drew their short swords and fought on. Leonidas fell in the thick of the fighting, and a desperate struggle began over his body. Finally, the sheer number of Persians pushed the Greeks back to a small hill. Surrounded, their weapons shattered, they fought on with daggers and sheer will. Xerxes, tired of losing men, ordered his archers to finish them. A hail of arrows rained down, and the last of the defenders fell. While a couple of Spartans sent as messengers survived the battle, nearly every Spartan and Thespian who made that final stand was killed. In a final act of rage, Xerxes ordered Leonidas's head to be cut off and his body impaled on a stake, an act considered barbaric at the time. On the surface, Thermopylae was a total defeat for the Greeks. The pass was open. Xerxes' army poured into central Greece and burned Athens to the ground. It looked like the sacrifice had been for nothing, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Strategically, the delay at Thermopylae was priceless. It gave the Greek navy time to reposition and prepare for the next decisive battle. The heavy casualties the Persians suffered, though perhaps not the 20,000 Herodotus claimed, also shook their confidence. This would prove critical. The Persian navy was lured into the narrow straits of Salamis and crushed by the smaller, more agile Greek ships. That naval victory was the turning point of the war. With his navy shattered and supply lines threatened, Xerxes retreated with a large part of his army, leaving his general Mardonius with a substantial force to finish the conquest. The next year, at the Battle of Plataea, a full-strength Greek army, inspired by the memory of Thermopylae, destroyed Mardonius's forces for good. The salvation of Greece was made possible by the stand at the Hot Gates. But the true legacy of Thermopylae is more than just military strategy. It became a founding story for Western civilization, a military defeat transformed into a moral victory. It's the ultimate symbol of courage against tyranny. The story of men choosing to die on their feet rather than live on their knees has echoed for 2,500 years. It cemented the idea that freedom isn't given. It has to be defended, sometimes to the death. In the end, the stand at Thermopylae was a declaration. It was proof that a small group of free people, united in purpose and willing to sacrifice everything, could stand against the mightiest empire on earth and, even in death, claim a victory for the ages.